Let's get real for a second. How many times have you felt like you're stuck in a rut, like you're just going through the motions of life without any real sense of purpose or direction? I know I have, and it's a pretty miserable feeling. But here's the thing, it doesn't have to be that way. You have the power to upgrade your mindset, to shift your perspective and start living the life you really want. And I'm not talking about some pie-in-the-sky, feel-good nonsense, I'm talking about real, tangible change. So, over the next 30 days, I want to challenge you to join me on a journey to upgrade your mindset, to start thinking differently, and to start living the life you deserve. First, let's talk about the ants of self-awareness. You can't change what you're not aware of, right? So, we need to start by taking a good hard look at ourselves, at our thoughts, our feelings, and our actions. I remember when I was in my early 20s, I was struggling to find my place in the world. I was working a job I hated, and I felt like I was just going through the motions. But then I started paying attention to my thoughts, to the way I was talking to myself, and to the way I was showing up in the world. And what I realized was that I was my own worst enemy. I was holding myself back with negative self-talk, with fear, and with doubt. So, I started working on that, I started practicing self-compassion, and I started to shift my mindset. And it wasn't easy, but it was worth it. For example, I used to be a huge procrastinator. I would put things off until the last minute, and then I would stress myself out trying to get them done on time. But then I started breaking things down into smaller, more manageable tasks. I started focusing on one thing at a time, and I started taking consistent action. And you know what? It worked. I started getting more done, I started feeling more confident, and I started to believe in myself. And it's not just about getting more done, it's about feeling more fulfilled, more purposeful. When you're taking action towards your goals, you start to feel like you're living the life you're meant to live. Now, let's talk about the power of gratitude. I know it sounds simple, but trust me, it's a game changer. When you focus on what you're grateful for, you start to shift your perspective. You start to see the world in a different way, and you start to appreciate the little things. I remember when I was going through a tough time, I was feeling really down, really stuck. But then I started practicing gratitude. I started writing down 3 things I was grateful for each day, and it totally shifted my mindset. I started to see that even in the tough times, there's always something to be grateful for. And it's not just about writing things down, it's about really feeling it, really experiencing it. For instance, I was on a plane ride a few years ago, and I was feeling really anxious. I was worried about the flight, I was worried about my destination, and I was worried about what was going to happen when I got there. But then I started focusing on my breath, I started focusing on the present moment, and I started to feel more calm, more centered. And then I started thinking about all the things I was grateful for. I was grateful for the fact that I was safe, I was grateful for the fact that I had a roof over my head, and I was grateful for the fact that I had people in my life who cared about me. And it totally shifted my perspective, it totally changed my experience. I started to see that even in the midst of anxiety, there's always something to be grateful for. Next, let's talk about the ants of self-care. You can't pour from an empty cup, right? So, we need to start taking care of ourselves, we need to start prioritizing our own needs. I remember when I was in my early 30s, I was working non-stop, I was pushing myself to the limit, and I was burning out. I was exhausted, I was stressed, and I was feeling really unfulfilled. But then I started prioritizing self-care, I started taking time for myself, and I started doing things that nourished my mind, body, and soul. And it wasn't easy, it wasn't always convenient, but it was worth it. For example, I started taking yoga classes. I had never done yoga before, but I had heard great things about it, so I decided to give it a try. And it was amazing. It helped me to relax, it helped me to focus, and it helped me to feel more grounded. And it's not just about the physical benefits, it's about the mental and emotional benefits too. When you're taking care of your body, you're taking care of your mind, and you're taking care of your spirit. And it's not just about yoga, it's about finding what works for you, what nourishes you, and what makes you feel alive. Now, let's talk about the power of positive self-talk. The way we talk to ourselves matters, it really does. When we're negative, when we're critical, and when we're judgmental, we're holding ourselves back. But when we're positive, when we're encouraging, and when we're supportive, we're empowering ourselves. I remember when I was a kid, I was always told that I wasn't good enough, that I wasn't smart enough, and that I wasn't talented enough. But then I started to realize that those were just lies, that they were just limitations that had been placed on me by others. And I started to work on my own self-talk, I started to practice affirmations, and I started to shift my mindset. For instance, I used to be really hard on myself when I made mistakes. I would beat myself up, I would criticize myself, and I would feel like a failure. But then I started to practice self-compassion, I started to be kinder to myself, and I started to see that mistakes are just opportunities for growth. And it's not just about being kind to ourselves, it's about being realistic too. We're human, we're imperfect, and we're going to make mistakes. But it's how we respond to those mistakes that matters, it's how we learn from them, and it's how we use them to grow. Next, let's talk about the ants of community. We don't have to do this alone, we don't have to go through life by ourselves. When we surround ourselves with positive, supportive people, we start to feel more connected, more inspired, and more motivated. I remember when I was in my early 20s, I was feeling really lost, really alone. But then I found a community of like-minded people, people who were on a similar journey, and people who were supportive and encouraging. And it totally changed my life, it totally shifted my perspective. For example, I joined a book club. I had always loved reading, but I had never been part of a book club before. And it was amazing, we would meet once a month, we would discuss the book, and we would connect with each other. And it wasn't just about the books, it was about the people, it was about the community. We would support each other, we would encourage each other, and we would inspire each other. And it's not just about book clubs, it's about finding your tribe, finding your people, and finding your community. Now, let's talk about the power of forgiveness. Holding on to grudges, holding on to resentment, and holding on to anger is only going to hold us back. When we forgive, we're not doing it for the other person, we're doing it for ourselves. We're releasing the burden, we're letting go of the weight, and we're freeing ourselves. I remember when I was in a difficult relationship, I was feeling really hurt, really angry, and really resentful. But then I started to work on forgiveness, I started to let go, and I started to release the burden. And it wasn't easy, it wasn't always convenient, but it was worth it. For instance, I had to forgive myself. I had to forgive myself for staying in the relationship for so long, for putting up with the abuse, and for not taking care of myself. And it wasn't easy, it was a process, but it was necessary. When we forgive ourselves, we're not excusing our behavior, we're not justifying our actions, we're simply releasing the burden. We're letting go of the guilt, the shame, and the regret, and we're freeing ourselves to move forward. Next, let's talk about the ants of taking risks. Playing it safe, playing it small, and playing it cautious is only going to hold us back. When we take risks, we're not guaranteed success, but we're guaranteed growth. We're guaranteed to learn, to evolve, and to become more of who we're meant to be. I remember when I was in my late 20s, I was feeling really stuck, really stagnant. But then I took a risk, I quit my job, and I started my own business. And it was terrifying, it was uncertain, but it was worth it. For example, I had to take a risk and invest in myself. I had to invest in my education, my skills, and my personal growth. And it wasn't easy, it wasn't always convenient, but it was necessary. When we invest in ourselves, we're not just investing in our future, we're investing in our present. We're investing in our happiness, our fulfillment, and our well-being. And it's not just about the money, it's about the time, the energy, and the effort. When we prioritize ourselves, we're prioritizing our growth, our evolution, and our success. Now, let's talk about the power of mindfulness. Being present, being aware, and being mindful is the key to unlocking our true potential. When we're mindful, we're not worried about the past, we're not anxious about the future, and we're not distracted by our thoughts. We're present, we're focused, and we're fully engaged. I remember when I was in my early 30s, I was feeling really overwhelmed, really stressed. But then I started practicing mindfulness, I started meditating, and I started being more present. And it totally shifted my perspective, it totally changed my experience. For instance, I started taking walks in nature. I would go to the park, I would walk through the woods, and I would be present. I would focus on my breath, I would focus on my surroundings, and I would let go of my thoughts. And it was amazing, I would feel more calm, more centered, and more connected. And it's not just about nature, it's about being present in every moment. When we're mindful, we're not just living in the present, we're living in the moment. We're fully engaged, we're fully alive, and we're fully ourselves. Next, let's talk about the ants of setting boundaries. We can't pour from an empty cup, we can't give what we don't have. When we set boundaries, we're not being selfish, we're being selfless. We're taking care of ourselves, we're prioritizing our own needs, and we're making sure we have enough to give. I remember when I was in my late 20s, I was feeling really drained, really exhausted. But then I started setting boundaries, I started saying no, and I started prioritizing my own needs. And it wasn't easy, it wasn't always convenient, but it was worth it. For example, I had to set boundaries with my family. I had to learn to say no, I had to learn to prioritize my own needs, and I had to learn to take care of myself. And it wasn't easy, it was a process, but it was necessary. When we set boundaries, we're not pushing people away, we're pulling ourselves towards what's truly ant. We're prioritizing our own growth, our own evolution, and our own success. And it's not just about saying no, it's about saying yes to ourselves. We're saying yes to our own needs, yes to our own desires, and yes to our own dreams. Now, let's talk about the power of self-reflection. Looking inward, looking at our thoughts, our feelings, and our actions is the key to unlocking our true potential. When we reflect on ourselves, we're not criticizing, we're not judging, and we're not being too hard on ourselves. We're simply observing, we're simply noticing, and we're simply learning. I remember when I was in my early 30s, I was feeling really stuck, really uncertain. But then I started practicing self-reflection, I started journaling, and I started looking inward. And it totally shifted my perspective, it totally changed my experience. For instance, I started reflecting on my relationships. I would look at the people in my life, I would look at the dynamics, and I would look at the patterns. And I would ask myself questions: what am I getting from this relationship, what am I giving, and what am I learning? And it was amazing, I would gain insights, I would gain clarity, and I would gain wisdom. And it's not just about relationships, it's about reflecting on every area of our lives. When we look inward, we're not just looking at our flaws, we're looking at our strengths, our talents, and our gifts. We're looking at our potential, our possibilities, and our promise. Next, let's talk about the ants of taking care of our physical health. Our body is our temple, our body is our home. When we take care of our physical health, we're not just taking care of our body, we're taking care of our mind, our spirit, and our soul. I remember when I was in my late 20s, I was feeling really sluggish, really tired. But then I started taking care of my physical health, I started exercising, and I started eating well. And it wasn't easy, it wasn't always convenient, but it was worth it. For example, I started going to the gym. I would go 3 times a week, I would work out, and I would feel amazing. I would feel more energized, more motivated, and more confident. And it's not just about the gym, it's about finding what works for you, what nourishes you, and what makes you feel alive. When we take care of our physical health, we're not just taking care of our body, we're taking care of our entire being. We're taking care of our happiness, our fulfillment, and our well-being. Now, let's talk about the power of learning from our mistakes. Mistakes are not failures, mistakes are not weaknesses. Mistakes are simply opportunities for growth, for learning, and for evolution. When we learn from our mistakes, we're not dwelling on them, we're not beating ourselves up over them, and we're not regretting them. We're simply using them as a chance to learn, to grow, and to become more of who we're meant to be. I remember when I was in my early 20s, I made a mistake that cost me a lot of money, a lot of time, and a lot of energy. But then I started to learn from it, I started to reflect on it, and I started to use it as a chance to grow. For instance, I started to look at the mistake as a lesson. I would ask myself questions: what did I learn from this experience? What would I do differently next time? And what can I apply to my future? And it was amazing. I would gain insights, I would gain clarity, and I would gain wisdom. And it's not just about the mistake, it's about the mindset. When we learn from our mistakes, we're not fixed on the past, we're focused on the present, and we're looking towards the future. We're not dwelling on what went wrong, we're dwelling on what can go right. Next, let's talk about the ants of staying positive. Staying positive is not about ignoring the negative, it's not about pretending that everything is okay when it's not. Staying positive is about focusing on the good, focusing on the positive, and focusing on the possibilities. When we stay positive, we're not just feeling better, we're not just thinking better, we're living better. I remember when I was in my late 20s, I was feeling really down, really stuck. But then I started practicing positivity, I started focusing on the good, and I started looking for the silver lining. And it totally shifted my perspective, it totally changed my experience. For example, I started to focus on the things that were going right in my life. I would make a list, I would write down 3 things that I was grateful for, and I would reflect on them. And it was amazing, I would feel more positive, more hopeful, and more inspired. And it's not just about gratitude, it's about finding the lesson in every experience. When we stay positive, we're not just looking at the surface level, we're looking deeper. We're looking for the opportunity, the growth, and the evolution. Now, let's talk about the power of living in the present moment. The present moment is all we have, the present moment is all we can control. When we live in the present moment, we're not worried about the past, we're not anxious about the future, and we're not distracted by our thoughts. We're present, we're focused, and we're fully engaged. I remember when I was in my early 30s, I was feeling really overwhelmed, really stressed. But then I started practicing mindfulness, I started living in the present moment, and I started being more aware. And it totally shifted my perspective, it totally changed my experience. For instance, I started to focus on my breath. I would take deep breaths, I would focus on the sensation, and I would let go of my thoughts. And it was amazing, I would feel more calm, more centered, and more grounded. And it's not just about the breath, it's about being present in every moment. When we live in the present moment, we're not just living in the moment, we're living in the now. We're fully engaged, we're fully alive, and we're fully ourselves. As we come to the end of this journey, I want to leave you with a challenge. I want to challenge you to take the next 30 days to upgrade your mindset, to shift your perspective, and to start living the life you really want. It's not going to be easy, it's not going to be convenient, but it's going to be worth it. You're going to have to be brave, you're going to have to be courageous, and you're going to have to be willing to take risks. But I promise you, it's going to be worth it. You're going to feel more alive, more inspired, and more fulfilled. You're going to start living the life you deserve, the life you desire, and the life you're meant to live. So, let's do this, let's take the next 30 days to upgrade our mindset, and let's start living the life we really want.